All right, we'll do that again. The title of this session is Research Presentations, Empirical Research in Home Education. We have 4 presenters for you this afternoon, so we're going to move fairly quickly. All the presenters I'm going to give 15 minutes to. I'll give you a 5-minute warning and a 1-minute warning. And in order to preserve some time for Q&As, we are going to have to cut you off at that 15 minutes. So we'll go forward in just a minute, but I'm going to abuse my prerogative as a moderator and just shout out some people in the room. So this is kind of special to be a graduate of homeschooling and to have a number of my teachers here. So Deb Bell was my English teacher, 7th through 11th grade. Vicki Dincher was my high school science teacher. My brother Nick is here. And my first always and best teacher, my mom Colette Bales, is also here. So this is kind of special. Okay, so we're going to start with Albert Cheng. And I'll invite him up and he'll kick us off. Wow. Oh.
Keeping us on our toes.
Yeah, keep me on my toes. Yep, good to be here. My name's Albert Cheng. I'm from the University of Arkansas, in Arkansas, from the United States. I don't have any shout outs to give. I'm actually not a homeschool student, never was. I'm a public school kid, and I guess good things come out of public schools, maybe? Anyway, all right. Well, anyway, so this is some work, joint work that I've been doing with a few colleagues of mine, Sivan Tuchman, fellow graduate student, and Patrick Wolf is faculty at the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. So in this paper, we want to look at 2 small populations in the United States, namely homeschoolers and students with special needs. All right, and we're going to look at some satisfaction ratings. So I want to, let me move to the side here so I can see better. Oh, that's okay, I'll stand here. So just to contextualize the issue here. So there's some debate as to whether homeschooling is a suitable option for serving students with special needs. Some pros and cons, right? Some suggestions, right? So homeschooling on one hand, you might think that this would provide some opportunities to individualize learning experiences, particularly for this population of students, right? Students with special needs are very, very unique. And so homeschooling might be an ideal situation to serve these unique needs. On the other hand, we've heard about this throughout some of the conference presentations this week. A lot of parents choose to homeschool because of bullying, social stigma that their child has experienced in the public schools and other schools. And so, again, this is probably a more salient issue for students with special needs. And so it's also possible homeschooling could benefit students with special needs or other disabilities in this way. Okay, on the other hand, there is some concern and some criticism about this, whether homeschooling is a viable option. One criticism that comes up quite frequently is whether homeschool parents are equipped to teach their children. We've heard it from a number of our homeschooling parents that there was concern of whether they would be able to homeschool their kids if they weren't credentialed teachers. You can imagine this concern might be raised, particularly for this population of students that have special needs and students with disabilities. Another issue here is that, so there's been some research in the special needs literature suggesting that if you include special needs students in, put them in classes, right, with other students that don't have special needs, in other words, mainstream them, integrate them with other students, who don't have special needs, that they tend to benefit in certain ways if they're in those types of environments. There is some concern out there whether if you take a child with special needs and put them in a kind of exclusive and isolated homeschool environment, whether they would be able to benefit from that type of environment. Of course, we do have some socialization research that could speak to this. Again, it's an empirical test, and we really don't have much evidence for or against that. Now, I will want to highlight a few prior studies about homeschooling and special needs. There's some evidence out there, empirical evidence, that suggests homeschooling is a promising approach to serve students with special needs. Steve Duvall is probably the pioneer, or probably one of the only people that have done work in this area. And I mean, he finds in the series of pretty fascinating studies, basically he actually observes homeschool settings and public school classrooms and counts things like time on task for students with special needs. Do they misbehave in class? And essentially finds that the homeschool environment is at least as conducive to serving students with special needs as traditional public schools. One criticism of these sets of studies, though, is, they are very small sample sizes of convenience. We're talking about 4 students here and there. So you wonder how generalizable these findings are. I do want to highlight that there is an emerging branch of research in the U.S. about and growth in virtual schools, online schools, and actually the enrollment in those schools is actually growing for students with disabilities. We also know from other literature that a lot of homeschool families are now jumping onto these types of services to meet their students' needs. The research, at least for virtual schools, shows that students with disabilities become more satisfied with this new option relative to their prior public school. Of course, we're not sure how many homeschoolers there are in that sample, and it'd be nice to compare the homeschool kids with students in other sectors of the U.S. school system. Okay, so that's what we're going to do, and so we're going to look at this in some data that we have. So the U.S. Department of Education collects a bunch of data, and one of the data sets that the government collects in the United States is called the National Household Education Survey. We have a nationally representative sample of the U.S. population, and we have about 2,000 families that were surveyed and interviewed who have children that have special needs. Okay, I'm also going to restrict the whole sample here to parents who are receiving services from local school districts or other government agencies, okay? Because it is odd to rate satisfaction if you're the special needs teacher, right? So we're going to exclude parents that are providing their own special needs services. We're going to count parents who are getting services from other people. Okay, so that's the sample. And on that sample, there's a survey, and a section of that survey consists of a series of 4-point Likert type items, Likert scales. And what they ask the parents to do is to rate satisfaction with a variety of components of the special needs services that they're getting. Okay, we're going to ask things about how satisfied are you with the communication that your service provider gives you? How satisfied are you with the therapist? How satisfied you with their commitment? Those types of things. Okay, and again, we're going to look at satisfaction as an outcome. Now, it's unclear, of course, what we are really capturing with satisfaction. I will argue that, it is a universal measure of quality, right? We usually ask how satisfied people are with services and use that to assess how good that service is. On the other hand, I think this is an outcome that's applicable to students with disabilities, right? It's unclear what the educational goals ought to be for this special population of students. And so perhaps by looking at satisfaction, we can get a sense of how well these students are being served. Okay, so I'm going to just jump straight to the results. If you like all the method stuff, run a series of regressions. I want to present regression-adjusted means that control for all sorts of things. But here's the breakdown, and we're going to look at comparisons between homeschooling and then all the other types of schools in the U.S., okay? So just to show you how these graphs work, so this is satisfaction ratings with the special education service provider, okay? And so you have the bar graph, or the bar on the very left for homeschool parents. And again, the higher the bar, the more satisfied the parents are with their special needs service. Okay, so as you can see from this, in general, this is the pattern you're going to get from all the other ratings. Homeschool parents are in general going to appear more satisfied with, in this case, their service provider than TPS stands for traditional public school. We have charter schools in the U.S. They're actually more satisfied than parents of Catholic school children. What you notice here, on the other hand, though, is non-religious private schools and religious non-Catholic schools parents in those two school sectors report similar satisfaction ratings with the special education service provider as homeschool children. Okay, so you're going to see this type of pattern throughout. So this is what it looks like for the service provider. Here we have satisfaction ratings for the special needs teacher or therapist. Okay, so you can kind of see, again, homeschool parents, approximately similar levels of satisfaction as parents who go to non-religious private schools or frequent the religious non-Catholic schools. Lower satisfaction ratings in traditional public schools, charter schools, which again are, actually I guess I should say these are publicly funded schools that could be privately managed, just if you're not familiar with that. Forget I'm in international audience here. So, okay, so they're public schools, publicly funded, but they can be privately managed. They're not subsequent to the same regulations as traditional public schools. And again, lower ratings in among parents who send their special needs children to Catholic schools. Okay, again, this is satisfaction ratings with the teacher or the therapist. Here's satisfaction ratings with the service provider's ability to accommodate the needs of the child with special needs. Again, similar picture. You actually see on the very right-hand side parents who send their kids to non-religious private schools or religious non-Catholic schools showing a bit more satisfaction with the services that they get in those schools. But once again, homeschooling, being a bit slightly higher than the parents in those other three sectors. Okay. All right. Last thing here, satisfaction with the provider's commitment. Okay, the commitment of the provider to help the child. Again, same picture. Higher ratings among homeschool parents than traditional public schools, charter schools, Catholic schools. About the same, if not higher, among parents who send their kids to non-religious private schools or religious non-Catholic private schools. I will mention, it is interesting to point out the Catholic school effect there. You might wonder if this is just post hoc rationalization, right? I mean, a parent chooses homeschool, so of course I'm going to be more satisfied with my services. I want to point out, it's interesting that we don't get that same thing with Catholic schools because, again, parents sending their kids to Catholic schools are also choosing the Catholic schools, and yet they're exhibiting lower levels of satisfaction. So we take that to be some indication that this isn't just parents saying something answering in a way they should be answering or post hoc rationalization. Okay, so in conclusion here, I'm going to wrap up. Oh, so this is just overall satisfaction. Just one more thing. If you average the responses on those 4 dimensions, you can get an overall satisfaction rating. So again, similar picture. Okay, so just in conclusion, so there is some debate about whether homeschooling is a viable option to serve students that have special needs. There's some criticism that homeschooling is not suitable. Well, what we have here is maybe some suggestive evidence that maybe that's not the case. If you take satisfaction as an indicator of quality, or at least an inherently important outcome, we do see parents of homeschool children reporting higher levels of satisfaction, so that could be an indication of better quality. Maybe, maybe not. Again, as I said here, parents who receive services from a third party are more satisfied with their aspects of special needs services, although we do see some evidence of greater levels of satisfaction among parents who send their children to religious non-Catholic schools. Okay, and I will end it there and cede the rest of my time.
Thank you very much. Next, we're going to invite Dr. Brian Ray to give his presentation.
Sorry, photo op. That look too contrived? Come on, Albert.
I'm trying to make sure I know which one I'm doing. I'm doing 2 today, so I'm going to watch this. Okay, how does this work? Not forward?
Forward. Yeah.
Forward. All right.
Do you want to give it a try?
Yeah, let's make sure it's working. It's working.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon. No, am I supposed to? Oh, I'm supposed to use this. Man. Oh, I like that better. Good afternoon. Is that working? Not yet. Okay, there you go. There we go. So, for a long time, the topic today, this first one, is the transmission of culture, religion, and affinity for home education to adults who were homeschooled, public schooled, and private schooled. We have to have long titles, and that one kind of qualifies. So what's been happening for years and years and years, at least in the American scene, the North American, whatever it's called, the North American United States scene, is we've had people measuring things like test scores, social development, those kinds of things. But way back in 1993, Greg Cizik said maybe this is the mismeasure of homeschooling, because if many parents who homeschool profess to be Christians and profess that they want to home educate to pass on Christian thought and Christian behavior and Christian values, biblical ideas to their children, is that really happening? Does home education make any difference? So, and I think this should be of interest to anybody who's interested in child development and sociological movements and so forth. People ask, well, what is important to the culture? What is important to scholars of X persuasion or scholars of Y persuasion? Some scholars want the world to move in a particular direction. It might be progressivism. Others might want it to move in a rightist direction. That's not very many of them. Or, it could be all kinds of things where people want culture to go. And so the question is, well, what's important to home educators? And you can't say what's important to home educators in general, because there's a lot of variety and diversity amongst homeschoolers. So I zeroed in on a particular group. Back in 2006, Barna in the United States does quite a bit of surveying religious-related things, and he said, quote, most 20-somethings put Christianity on the shelf following spiritually active teen years, unquote, when he was studying people from Christian backgrounds. And this surprised and bothered a lot of Christians in the United States to hear this. Back in 2004, I did a study of adults who were home educated, and I found certain things. I asked a lot of questions. I was very shallow and did not go deep into hardly anything. But there was some evidence that possibly, maybe, adults who were home educated were more likely to be similar to their parents' beliefs than others in the general culture. In 2009 in Canada, Van Pelt, Allison, and Allison did a study also of adults and found some things similar to what I found. But again, fairly shallow and not much depth and not many controls in terms of comparing things. 2015, Sikic and Skiles did a survey in North America, and they found some very nuanced and mixed things about adults who were from different schooling backgrounds. I would point out one thing. They don't know the whole history of these people, so they don't know whether they were home educated for 5 years or 12 years or 1 year. So I take the findings with many grains of salt, so to speak. We'll see. So what was I trying to do here? Examine adults who were home educated and churched while growing up, but not just home educated, from any background. So this was a study, really was not just a homeschool study. This was a study of anybody who was churched growing up in the United States. That is just too wild. Okay, so they're 18 to 38 years of age today. In order to understand key influences, family, church experience, culture inputs, years in homeschool or private school or public school as independent variables, and try to understand what might encourage them or deter them from believing and practicing the Christian faith of their parents, and to determine their attitudes and practices toward home education or not of their own children. So I probably bit off more than I should have, but I need help from somebody like Albert here to analyze this stuff. The hypotheses would be that the adults who were home educated, most of their primary and secondary years would be more similar to their parents and their belief system, and that those who were home educated, most of their years would be more favorable toward an attitude or at least plans or actual practices of home educating their children. So I need somebody, are you going to give me a warning, like a 5-minute warning or something like that? Good, I need that. Okay, so I already told you the target population was all United States, age 18 to 38 now, who were churched while growing up. There was purposive sampling and convenient sampling, and had a secondary sample We paid somebody to get a representative sample. And after sorting things out, I ended up with 8,000. It's probably the wrong use of a comma here internationally. I need help with that. But anyway, over 8,000 for this analysis today. Go. Some quick demographics, just so you have some sense. Disproportionately female, which is not unusual in these kinds of studies. Marital status, I didn't break that all out for you. I'm trying to simplify this for today. About half married, a little under half never married, and then other. Let's see, age, average age was 27 in this study. And the other ones are just kind of fun. I do have comparative data for the general population on most of these things, but I'm just not ready yet for putting it into graphs for you. Sorry. Okay, the formal educational attainment. I thought this would be a little more important. So you can see that. I won't read it all to you, but you can see maybe, let's see, what would that be? 43, 53. About 55% have a couple of years of college or more, which is not that different from the general population these days. This is not for you to read right now, but I just wanted you to see that there were a variety of people from different religious backgrounds. That's today. I'm sorry. That's their religious preference today as adults. All right? I don't want to confuse you with what they were raised in, but this is the people in the study. So you can see that yes, heavy on the, where did it go? Christian and non-denominational, but we also had agnostics and atheists and Buddhists and so forth in the study. That's their religious preference today. I just wanted you to see that. So, where did they spend 7 or more of their years growing up? So, almost 44% were home educated, 7 or more years. About 12% in Christian school, 1% in private secular school, and almost 44% of these people spent most of their years in public school growing up. So we got the variety we were looking for in this. So then for the analysis of what are they like today based on what kinds of things did they experience growing up. So the independent variables, the things growing up were Christian experiences, like going to church or not, going to Sunday school or not, those kinds of things. Family relations while growing up, reduced down to just 2 questions. What was your relationship with your father like when you were 16 to 17 years old? And what was your relationship with your mother like when you were 16 to 17 years old? Sounds very simplistic, but those are the only 2 items that really helped me understand what was going on here. Youth, how many years spent in a youth group in the United States? In churches, we call them youth groups, where a bunch of young people get together and maybe have a Bible study or have pizza together, whatever it might be, okay? How many years did you spend in Christian schools? How many years were you homeschooled? How many years did you spend in private secular school? And how many years were you in public school? Those were the independent variables that I was considering. So now, this was very simplified with the dependent variable of orthodox beliefs. And that's not orthodox like you might be thinking in Russia. This is core Christianity. Jesus is God. There is a heaven or not, and some core Christian beliefs in an instrument that's been used for about 60 years in the United States for studying Christian orthodoxy. So I did not create this thing out of nowhere. Very simply put, 5 of the independent variables explain significant amounts of variance in orthodox beliefs. A plus sign means it was a positive relationship. A negative sign represents an inverse or negative correlation. So you can see what they experience, and this is also in descending order. So this was the most significant factor, second most significant, third most significant, fourth, and fifth, and the other 2 were not significant. So the experiences, behaviors early in life, homeschool years, and family relationships are positively related to their core Christian beliefs. Number of years in youth group and number of years in private secular school were negative related to their core Christian beliefs. And the other 2, like I said, I think there were 2 more, were not significant. Then Christian beliefs in general. So this is much more than just 6 items. Several other Christian beliefs are all explained in the paper. Again, Christian behaviors early in life, number of homeschool years, positive. Family relations, again, positive. Years in youth group and private secular school, negative relationship. I'll summarize all this at the end because this is 5 minutes, 4.5 minutes, 5 minutes. Okay, then Christian behaviors as an adult. So yes, this is about what most evangelical, conservative, Orthodox Christians would consider Christian behaviors. Again, what did they experience growing up? Did they go to church or not? Did they have a good relationship with mom and dad? Did they say they had a good relationship with mom and dad? Yes. Number of years homeschooled, again, positive. Again, youth group, negative. Private secular school, negative. A couple more here. General satisfaction in life. Only 2 variables were good predictors. Relationship with mom and dad was the most. And then what experiences growing up in terms of Christian behaviors, going to Sunday school and church and those kinds of things. I think I have 2 more? Oh no, I have 3 more. Okay, civic and community involvement. Now things start to change up a little bit here. You can see the variables are a little different. Christian behaviors early in life. Then youth group, positive correlation with how much they're civically involved today. Family relations is still in there. And then private secular school, you have a positive relationship all of a sudden with civic and community involvement now. But only 4, and notice at the top, does this have a little laser thingy? Right here. One thing I haven't been talking about, notice all of these together explain only 1% of variance. So for those of you who know what that means, you know what it means. Okay, so, then how similar to father's beliefs? Again, positive relationship with mom and dad, number of years homeschooled, Christian behaviors early in life, again, all positive related. Back to youth group years, negative, and now the Christian school pops in at the end with a positive relationship. Very almost identical to similar with mother's beliefs. I got to speed it up here. Now, who plans or not to homeschool their children? So if you were homeschooled 7 or more years, 56% of them are or will only homeschool their children. And then others will mix it up. Maybe some homeschool, maybe some private school, maybe some public school. That's another 25% of those who are homeschooled. If you were in Christian school, 34% plan to only homeschool. If you're in private secular school, only 21%. Public school, to me this is really interesting. 36% of them plan to homeschool. So I'll keep moving here. What do I have? 2 minutes? Ooh, oh, that's right there. Oh, that's nice. Okay, some working conclusions. This is how a researcher gets out of saying anything real definite. Say working conclusions. All right? Working conclusions. This is a quick summary of what you saw. And if you want to take a picture of it, fine. But there's a pattern. I think you can see a pattern that the practices, Christian practices growing up or experiences was consistently in there in terms of a positive relationship almost all the way across. Relationship with mom and dad as a teenager was all throughout positive related. The youth group experience years was pretty negative in most ways. The homeschool, number of years homeschool was positive in most cases. It showed up more than it did not. All of the blanks are no significant relationship. So here we go. 3 factors stand out as the most dependable and significant predictors of Christian beliefs and behaviors as adult. And those are Christian practices or experiences when young, solid and positive relationship with father and mother during the ages of 16 and 17, and more years being homeschooled. Regarding the educational plans for their children, I think you can see from the charts, heavily oriented toward homeschooling if they were homeschooled. But I think for me, it was very interesting, such high percentages of even those who are public schooled and private secular and Christian school are planning to homeschool. Again, I'm studying people who were churched while growing up and who are now adults. Strong and disproportionate portions plan to homeschool. Let's see here. Ooh, 22 seconds. I think that when you look at the data here, where I have something of a representative sample of adults in that age group. Also considering that on average, Christians and people in the homeschool world tend to have more children than average, I think you're going to see significant growth in homeschooling over the next couple of decades in the United States. And that's a good place to stop. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ray. And now we'll invite Dr. Debra to give her presentation. Do you have the mobile mic?
Thank you, Brian. Right, hello. And my study is the types of homeschools and support for achievement motivation. Here's the background for this study. I wanted to design a study that would be meaningful to the homeschool population. And I think a lot of the research that's been done about us is not always anything that we care about. And my research interests broadly are to try to identify the best practices for homeschooling. So I have a hypothesis that there are some advantages to homeschooling. There's some teaching practices, there's some conditions that will make homeschooling more successful, and there may be some that might undermine the opportunities that homeschooling affords. Also, I think as a homeschool researcher, we're always dealing with the challenge of finding it very difficult to collect a representative sample. And so I knew that I would only have a convenience sample, and I wanted to ask some questions. So a convenience sample is when you have to get people to voluntarily participate in your study, and I think it follows that people who volunteer are people who are probably having a positive experience, and people who are not having a positive experience are not going to want to do your study. So what could I do with a convenient sample that might be meaningful for us? I also needed a theoretical lens in order to make sense of my findings and to nest my findings within a body of scholarly research. And self-determination theory is a theory that I felt had great significance for me as an educator and as a homeschool parent. And it has been around for 20, 30 years. It has been applied to many domains, not just an educational setting, but health and sports and the workplace. It's never been extended to a homeschool sample, so in research you want to be extending the research. And I want to just quickly give you an overview of one of the tenets of self-determination theory. They're interested in the antecedents of autonomous motivation. And I think for those of us who homeschool, it's a love for learning, but autonomous motivation is intrinsic motivation, self-generated, self-perpetuated, self-endorsed. And self-determination theory says that these three elements are present in order to produce autonomous motivation: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Here's a definition of my terms. Autonomy is the need to perceive oneself as the locus of control of one's own behavior. Competence is the need to feel capable of one's interaction with the social environment and experience opportunity to express your own capacity. And relatedness is to feel socially connected and valued by others. So self-determination theory says when these three opportunities are available to a student, a worker, a child, an athlete, then intrinsic motivation is going to be produced and sustained. And they have also theorized that autonomous motivation is not really, or that these three needs are not really readily available for students in a conventional classroom setting. They've been able to find the opposite of autonomous motivation there. So the focus of my interest was achievement motivation. We got to measure something, and so achievement motivation is goal-directed behavior. And as I interpreted it for us here today, it's that love for learning. And think about kids in a conventional classroom. So one of the problems in Ed Psych that we're trying to solve is the fact that the longer kids spend in a conventional setting, the more their achievement motivation declines. And so we wonder, is that a natural part of development, or is the context contributing to this decline? Because we've not been able to find a context where over time achievement motivation increases, and I was curious to find out what might happen in a homeschool sample. My research questions were what naturally occurring types of homeschools may exist along the social contextual dimensions of support for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, and these are the three needs self-determination theory posits. Then I wanted to look at what teaching strategies characterize the types of homeschools found in answering the first research question, and then what demographic factors such as family level, parent, and student level factors were associated with the different types of homeschools I found in question 1. So I need to tell you about the sample that I collected. I collected it online from a variety of sites representing different affinity groups. Like I went out and found support groups for unschoolers. I got a large response rate from an online provider of AP courses, and I did offer a small incentive in order to. What I was trying to do is get diversity. That's what I wanted to do, was get diversity. And so in the end, the number of cases that I examined was 457. However, I did not get the diversity that I was looking for, and so this convenience sample was more white, affluent, and much better educated than the NCES data on homeschooling and the general US population. So what am I going to do with these people? They were less conservative and religious than what Dr. Brian Ray had found in his previous research. And also what I ended up collecting was data on families who were highly committed and highly experienced. So 54% had homeschooled longer than 7 years, and 74% said they would homeschool next year. So what can I find out about them? Here is their motivation for homeschooling, and the number one reason was a desire for child-centered approach to homeschooling. So you can see that they are less, they're less like some of our samples in the past. So we need to focus our unit of analysis so when you ask parents questions, they're thinking about the same thing. So I asked parents to tell me about the child they'd homeschooled the longest, and I did end up getting a nice even distribution, I think, of female and male, and even they were slightly older. You see that a strong portion were at the end of high school. Sorry, am I doing? I'm just focusing on okay. So what I did is a cluster analysis, and because we have a much more generalized audience, I'm not even going to explain that. But cluster analysis was just, I did some statistical manipulation in order to see what kinds of groups were in this large sample, and I used some existing measures from self-determination theory. So the problems in school measure is used to measure whether a teacher provides autonomy support or controlling motivational style in the classroom, and that was piloted and revised with a homeschool sample. Patterns of adaptive learning scale, that's out of the University of Michigan, and it's looking at the goal structure in the classroom. You two, I'm assuming, might be familiar with that. We revised that for homeschooling. And then a conditional regard is a measure that we used as a proxy for relatedness. And again, it was from an Israeli professor, and we had it translated, and I revised and piloted. So this is my dissertation. So this is a huge study, and getting it cut down to a journal article is going to be my next challenge. So a lot went on in this effort, and it's not typical of what scholarly research going forward ought to look like. So thank you for bearing with me here. And then after I divided them into clusters along these dimensions of support for autonomy, relatedness, and competence, in order to validate that you have actually actually found some, naturally occurring, like authentic types of homeschoolers that might be out there. You have to use some external variables and find differences that would be significant. So I decided to look at the satisfaction of parents in terms of their own needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. I also wanted to ask parents their perception of their child's school engagement. That's my measure of achievement motivation. And I also created a new measure of homeschool teaching practices. I drew these teaching practices from self-determination theory, and I also worked with some homeschool experts to come up with potential teaching practices, and then I piloted that. I have a copy of it with me here today for anybody who would like to look at this measure, because I think that's one of the things I may have contributed to the research, is that this teaching practices measure ended up having good, broke down into the factors that I wanted nicely, and it helped to explain some of the differences. So this is the result of my cluster analysis of pedagogical diversity. And basically what you want to look at is group 1 and group 5. They're the opposite. They're the opposite of each other, and group 1 is autonomy supporting, and group 5 had more of a controlling motivational style. So the good things that we think that we need to have for kids to have achievement motivation are in group 1, and the opposite of what you'd want to have if you want your kids to love to learn are in group 5, and then I had mixed groups in between. So here's some of the things I found. That group 1, the parents of the children in group 1 had significantly higher need satisfaction themselves, and that group 5 had significant lower need satisfaction than all other groups. Group 5 had reported significantly lower academic engagement from their children than all other groups. And group 1 had significantly higher academic engagement than 3 of the 4 remaining groups. So what theory would predict proved to be true, that the parents who were providing support for those needs had kids who they perceived as loving to learn, and the parents who were not able to provide support for those needs had kids who were losing interest in learning. This is the results of the teaching practices. Group 1 was using autonomy supporting teaching practices, where group 5 was less likely, was using more controlling teaching practices. And also group 1 and group 3 were significantly higher in support for competence. And so teaching practices used correlated as expected with self-determination theories, autonomy, competence, and relatedness measures. And this lends external validity to the teaching practices measure that I developed. What were some of the demographic differences? So group 1, this is the guys doing what we think are the good stuff. They were less religious and more left-leaning politically than other groups. So that was a significant difference. Group 5 was more likely to be working outside the home. Group 5, parents reported more external monitoring by an outside agency, so state regulations, or they're in some kind of umbrella school. What was surprising to me is that group 5 was statistically more likely to be male. But there was only 29 males in that group, and there were less than 5 males in the other groups. So this has to be interpreted. This is just a surprising finding. I have hypotheses about what that might mean, but there were not enough men who were taking the survey to really come to some conclusion, but I'll tell you what I think. I mean, I just think that these were probably single dads. I wouldn't be surprised to find out these were single dads who were trying to homeschool and work. They reported, I think I might have that, they reported, they were more likely to report kids taking classes outside of the home and kids being independent and not monitoring. So I just think that these are maybe families that are homeschooling under less than the most ideal circumstances. So what I did find was this, then I unclustered and I did some analysis about just the students who were represented. And what I did find about academic engagement is the parents reported students who were homeschooled longer were perceived to have higher academic engagement with a moderate effect. So we have, we have slight, moderate, and large effect, and so this was a moderate effect size. Students who were older were perceived to have higher academic engagement, again, moderate effect size. All right, so this has to be interpreted with a lot of cautions. First study has to be replicated and validated, but possibly a homeschool context may be the first recognized context where, in self-determination theory, where we see that when these needs are met, as they would predict, academic achievement or achievement motivation increases over time. And there may be some things about the homeschool context that other educational, other educational contexts could learn something from. So that is my study. Thank you. And I did bring copies of my teaching practices if anybody would like to look. Yeah, do you mind?
Okay, good afternoon. Nope, it's the GHEC Bales. Get ready, Lindsay. Surprise! We've had a pretty great group of presentations so far, and I'm excited about the discussion that will take place afterwards. My name is Lauren Bales. I'm a doctoral candidate at The Ohio State University, which is in the Midwest in the United States. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a graduate of homeschooling, but I was also a Teach for America Corps member and taught in New York City public and charter schools, and have also worked as an instructional coach with a lot of public school teachers and parents. So a lot of what I'm about to talk to you about today comes from an interest in parents using the political resources available to them. And this is a particularly interesting in the case of homeschoolers, because in the United States 35 years ago, homeschooling was illegal in every state. So you heard some of the folks at this conference talk about the fact that they started homeschooling when it was still illegal. And in fact, this is quite the political accomplishment, to turn over a law in every state. So I was really interested in how exactly parents have rallied and utilized political resources in order to do something like that, and then what are the implications for other school organizations and spaces. So I'm going to go through one of my dissertation studies today. I'm doing a 3-paper dissertation. So I'll tell you a little bit about the data that I collected. I'll go very briefly through the methods, and then present some of the initial findings. And just as a caveat, these are very preliminary. The data are still coming in. The survey is still open. So this is you won't see fit statistics here because it's so preliminary, but I'm excited to hear what your feedback might be about this. So as I mentioned, I was really interested in, can we measure this thing called political efficacy? It has not been used, to my knowledge, at all in education. It's a political science construct. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in just a moment. But I was really interested in what kinds of parents have what levels of political efficacy, and what are perhaps some consequences of parents with high levels of political efficacy. I was also interested in how these political efficacy beliefs, which are beliefs about your ability to organize and execute skills to meet some desired future outcome, how they might be correlated or related to other agency beliefs. We'll talk about self-determination theory in just a moment. And then finally, and this is where it gets really interesting, is what are the actual behavioral outcomes for teaching parents? So what kind of instructional strategies do they use, and how are their students then engaged? So I have 3 sort of chunks of the conceptual framework that I'll discuss today. The first is just a little bit of brief history of school governance in the United States. Governance as a reform tool has been around for almost 200 years. So since the progressive era, people have been trying to restructure the governance of public schools in order to address the needs that they see. So whether it's political corruption and cronyism, or whether it's something like the leadership is too diverse and therefore the money is too spread out. So governance reforms have just sort of yo-yoed for a really long time. Michael Mintrum in a 2001 paper talks about centripetal and centrifugal governance reforms. Centripetal are those that centralize power, so something like mayoral control of a school system, or a governor's control of a school, of a state's system of education. Whereas centrifugal reforms are those that decentralize. So charter schools with private organizations, homeschooling would be one of the options in that category. And what Joe Murphy at Vanderbilt has said is that homeschooling is sort of a microcosm of larger concerns and perhaps conflicts in the world of education governance, particularly people who contest the idea that the state should have direct control of a student's education for their entire compulsory education career. And he says this is particularly visible in the homeschool world, but it's a conversation that's happening broadly in public schools, private schools, charter schools, voucher systems, you name it, that is a concern, and that is a way people are talking about school governance. And then finally, I think this quote from Somerville is great, and he calls homeschooling one of the great unpublicized political campaigns in US civic history. Again, this idea that in all US states this was illegal 35 years ago, it's hard to come up with an example, a parallel example in which something that was illegal that short a time ago is now legal and relatively mainstream in every state. So going from there, we move into this idea of political efficacy. And some of you may be familiar with the construct of efficacy. My advisor likes to say that in social science we don't have rules or laws in the same way that sort of the hard sciences do. We don't have the law of gravity, for example. But efficacy is probably as close as we get. So efficacy is so highly correlated with so many positive outcomes. And so in 1954, Campbell, Guerin, and Miller wrote a book called The Voter Decides about the American National Election Studies. And this construct of political efficacy was essentially an end note. So they had a couple of little items left over that they didn't have a name for the construct, and they suggested to future researchers, we think this should be called political efficacy. Someone else should look into this. And that's really how this was born. And most of the history of political efficacy has been conflict about the measurement and the name. Very little of it has been used to actually predict behavior. So that's sort of the direction that it's moving now. It also has undergone a long history of criticism because it's so global. And one of the key features of efficacy as a construct is that it needs to be domain and task specific. So I think that's one thing my research actually brings to this, is that actually it shifts it into an actual study of efficacy. Traditionally, political efficacy has two dimensions, internal and external. And internal is the measure of your particular ability to navigate a political field, a political arena. And then external political efficacy is your assessment of the arena's responsiveness to you. So you might see an item that says something like, people in Washington lose touch with the people pretty quickly. On the internal side of things, you might see something like, I feel like I have what it takes to govern as well as anybody else. So you see two very different kinds of beliefs about policy systems. And then finally, in terms of another body of literature, I'm not going to talk about very long, but I had the good fortune to have a friend and mentor who had just done a very large study of home educators. So I was able to borrow a little bit of a theoretical framework. So as she talked about, optimal conditions for motivation are met when you have individual and environmental supports for autonomy, relatedness, and competence. So moving forward, I was really interested in the need satisfaction, so the needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, how they predicted, or perhaps not predicted, but are associated with beliefs of efficacy, particularly political efficacy, and then how parents with different levels of political efficacy interacted with and designed the instruction of their children. So I had three research questions. One was just about the measure of political efficacy itself. Can we actually measure this construct in a home education context? A very similar survey is being done for my other papers right now, in which we're measuring it in public and charter school context. So there will be some interesting comparative possibility after that's done. Like I said, I was also interested in associations with other kinds of agency beliefs, and particularly homeschooling efficacy. And then finally, I was interested in the actual behaviors on the other side of it, and how parents assess their children's engagement in a home education context. And this was particularly exciting to me because I think in policy studies, we get really excited about associations between attitudes. And at some point, that becomes a little less interesting because they're all so closely related. So where we really have some power to talk about advancing theory and making changes, when we could say these attitudes actually, with some regularity, predict behaviors. So I did a pretty large survey. I worked with an organization that does homeschool conventions. Some of you might know it, the Great Homeschool Conventions. They have a mailing list of about 50,000 email addresses. I purchased an e-blast and sent this survey out. So it had a number of measures. I think I had about 21 demographic questions, the internal and external political efficacy, efficacy for homeschooling, the motivation for homeschooling, instructional practices, and the self-determination theory measures. This went out on January 25th. Within about a week, I had 1,000 responses. Within 2 weeks, I had 2,000 responses, which was very exciting. And just as a brief aside, so like I mentioned, I'm doing this survey also in public schools. And within that week, I had 40 emails from homeschooling parents who had taken the survey and had more to tell me. Thank you. So I got a number of different kinds of responses, everything ranging from thank you for doing a study of homeschooling to here are some questions you should have asked. But in a study of efficacy of homeschoolers, it was very interesting to get a wide range of efficacious responses in addition to the survey itself. So I did a number of statistical analyses on this. Again, very preliminary, so I've only done some basic missing data analyses and those kinds of things. So I did a series of regressions, and eventually this will be a path analysis, but I just wanted to set up some evidence for continuing with the SEM. Because there's no nesting function, because I don't have data about states or zip codes or anything like that, it's just going to be single level analyses. So nothing here is multi-level. So I'll go through these regression tables very quickly. I'm happy to share them with anyone who would like further information, but I'll just talk about sort of the main effects in each case. So this first relationship was using self-determination theory, so autonomy, competence, and relatedness to predict efficacy for homeschooling. You can see here there are main effects for both competence and autonomy. That's the total basic C and the total basic A. This is unsurprising because it's likely that individuals who feel that their basic needs are being met are going to be more efficacious in those same domains of activity. Here's the second one. This is interesting for my purposes. So on the left, you can see how efficacy for homeschooling predicted internal and external political efficacy. There were only negative effects in the external category. And this could mean a couple of things. One is that we just don't have a good handle on measuring external political efficacy, and this is not just the case in this context. There's a 60-year history of contention in measuring this particular construct in every domain. But what you can see is that efficacy for homeschooling predicted to a relatively strong degree, or is associated with, internal political efficacy, as are a host of demographic variables. That's also not surprising, as in the long history of this literature, usually it's richer white men who feel politically efficacious. So we're seeing a little bit of that here as well. And then finally, in this third sort of initial pathway, this is using efficacy for homeschooling. We've already seen that, so now we have the internal political efficacy predicting student engagement. So this is a parent's assessment of their students' engagement. And you can see here that it is a significant relationship. Some other interesting things emerge here too. So we have the total political external efficacy, is actually a negative relationship. Again, that could be an issue of measurement, or it could be the fact that perhaps largely homeschool parents generally don't feel externally politically efficacious. Either they don't feel like the system's responsive to them, or they don't feel like they need to deal with the system in order to bring about the outcomes that they want. But we've got some other interesting relationships here. So likely to homeschool next year, we've got the age of the oldest, and we actually have whether that family has a special needs child that they're homeschooling, which was an interesting relationship for me. Okay, so finally I want to talk about a few next steps with the minute and a half that I have left. This is a sort of important first quantitative step in understanding how parents feel efficacious in sort of the policy sphere of homeschooling, and how that leads them to assess the involvement and engagement of their students. I did survey the teaching strategies. I haven't done the cluster analysis yet, so that would be a next step. And that would sort of be a link between political efficacy, how do they then, what kinds of instructional strategies do they then engage, and how does that lead them to see engagement in their children. I think it does speak to broader issues of parent democratic activity and democratic involvement in school systems. And then I have a good bit of work left to do with this. So going from exploratory to confirmatory factor analysis, which would give me an indication of just how good the theory is for the data, and then also the structural equation modeling. So being able to test multiple hypotheses around those latent constructs at the same time. So I will close there, and thank you very much for your time and attention. And at this point, we have about 25 minutes for questions and answers. So I will hand the mic around to you and to the researchers. Feel free to address your questions to any or all of the researchers you heard today. Would anyone like to start? Yes, sir, way back here. Lights would be good. Yeah, I think we for the live stream. Thank you.
For each of you, oh, by the way, thank you for all your work and effort putting into this body of research. But for each one of you, if you could surmise the one biggest thing you found from your research that you did, what's one thing that kind of bubbled to the top that either surprised you or you know, you thought was really interesting?
Do you want to start?
I guess I could go.
Yeah.
I guess I could go up here. So what surprised me most was that so the negative effect on satisfaction among the parents who go to Catholic schools. So you know, in actually the satisfaction literature in school choice in general, you do see higher satisfactions for users of choice, Catholic schools inclusive. So I suppose that's what really popped out to me. It wasn't expected. No, that's not the homeschooling result. The homeschooling result, I don't know that it surprised me much. I could have seen it going either way, but certainly it came out positive and certainly higher than the Catholic school population.
We may need to have all the researchers
Yeah,
up here so they can use the mic. Dr. Ed, you wouldn't mind. I can speak to mine. So I was really surprised that the external political efficacy turned out to be a negative predictor and to be really tough to measure. That was not the case in the other studies that we've done. It actually loads fairly strongly. We've got a good set of 4 items with really high factor loadings. So the fact that that was not the case in this particular population means there's something else going on that I have more to do and more to uncover.
What I totally didn't expect was to find out about men who were the primary teacher in the home, and that I also don't think I had it in my slides. They had reported significantly lower need satisfaction. And I realized, well, men are probably marginalized in the homeschool community. I know in our homeschool support groups, we never think about teaching dads. And I even had some of them email me and say that some of my wording should have assumed the inclusion of males and females. So I will know that going forward.
for a long time when I do research, I'm a little concerned because even though I'm a perfectly objective researcher, some people think that I might have some biases. So I was not shocked, but it really stood out to me how positive the homeschool factor was in relationship to belief systems from a Christian worldview. But secondly, it really jumped out when we saw the importance of the relationship with mom and dad when they were 16 and 17. That was not something I was really expecting that much, but it was very obvious and very evident. The third thing was, made a lot of people upset, and they don't want to look at it, is the people involved in Christian schools seeing so many negative correlations between the number of years in Christian schools and Christian thinking as an adult. That was probably a little extra surprising.
Yeah, sorry. I was translating. I wanted to ask Debra if she could talk a little bit more. I'm not sure I understood till the end because English is not my first language, but you said the relation between autonomy development in families, in left political families, and yeah, if you could talk a little bit more about that. What did you measure and how did you find it?
What I looked at types of homeschools, and when I looked at the group one, the first group in my sample that reported the highest academic engagement in their children, and who also reported using teaching strategies that we associate with support for autonomy, support for competence, support for relatedness, how that group of parents did statistically differ from the other groups was that they tended to be more moderate politically. I mean, maybe left-leaning was too strong a word, but they were more they were more on the moderate to left side of the political spectrum than the right. And what else did I say about them? They were less religious. They were slightly less. They were statistically significantly less religious, and I did measure religiosity by church attendance.
Other questions? Thank you.
Albert, you probably addressed this, and I probably just missed it, but were the mean differences significant?
Yeah.
I had that question.
Yes. So yeah, if you're wondering about statistical significance, yes. They actually is my present. Well, yeah, it's there. I can show you the tables. Actually, let's just put it up, and then you can see.
Yeah. For anybody here who's wondering why we're talking about statistical significance, I'll just let you know that, like in research, does it matter? It only matters if you can reach statistical significance, and it's a numerical value that we're talking about.
And it indicates that it's better than chance. It's better than it happening at a chance rate.
So I'll just put the numbers up so we can get more questions in. But yes, you'll see the stars. Put it that way. So these are Elfine.
Looking for the stars, Albert.
Yeah, the proliferation of asterisks.
Okay, there you go. So these are just, so if you know how to read these are just raw score differences between the groups relative to home schools. Okay, so if you look at the first column, first row, parents in public who send their kids to public charter schools are about 0.16 scale points lower in satisfaction ratings when they're rating the provider's communication with the family. Okay, so I'll leave that up there for you to enjoy if you want that. No, these are actually raw scores. So standard deviations for the scores are about like 0.8. So kind of do the division. 0.16 would be close to 20% of a standard deviation.
I want to ask a question of my three colleagues here. In this kind of research, which sometimes gets a little politically loaded or a little emotionally loaded, or what it happens to be, whether you're friendly toward not or you're very neutral toward home education, What if you, for example, Albert, or either any of you three had found no significant difference? What importance does that have, if anything, in the context of education in your country? Because sometimes researchers get so sad when there's no significant difference.
Right. So on one thing, on one hand, so if there's no difference, I suppose maybe that's not necessarily bad news, right? I mean, if we're all equally satisfied with the services, then I don't know if that's really a big deal policy-wise. I will say, though, just to push back a little bit against that, so sometimes when we find no differences, the reason isn't because there's actually no differences, but you just don't have enough power in the data to actually detect differences. So it's possible statistically that differences are there in reality, but we just can't detect them using our methods. So sometimes it's worrisome if we don't find things, but other times, to your point, yeah, I mean, you have to ask, I guess, the relevant question, the policy relevant question. Do no differences matter? Sometimes it does, sometimes it really doesn't.
I think had I not found any significant differences, I would have said I needed a bigger sample. I didn't mention the response rate. Out of 50,000, I had 2,000, so it's about 4%, which is very, very small. However, I think I would have also said, well, maybe this is good news, or it's one thing we can eliminate as a predictor of the larger perspective of parent political efficacy, that this one thing actually doesn't have to do with it. And sometimes eliminating that one thing is actually really promising for next steps and for future research.
I totally expected to find statistically significant findings because I'm going to compare all these homeschoolers, and so I know that there was going to be differences in the data. So if I had found none, I would know that I had done bad statistical analysis. I just didn't know what differences I would find. I didn't know what differences I would find. Or how the groups would break down. I mean, they were relatively equal. That group 5 that really wasn't having a good time of it all was smaller than the other 4 groups, but it broke down pretty evenly, and the associations were surprising. So it was exploratory, and when you're doing exploratory, and I was trying to describe homeschooling, so I just think it was the kind of study where you would obviously have to have those differences.
Lauren gave me permission to answer my own question. So this is very important in research, and then a question. Researchers, especially new researchers, often think it's only important if I find statistical significance, which is not true. So for example, think in terms of policy. What if after all these years, and the very best statistically controlled study had ever been done on children's academic achievement in homeschooling versus whatever, and what if there was no difference? What if it was just zero difference? Keep in mind, however, that's with parents who are not government certified. That's with parents who are not receiving $11,000 plus of tax dollars, and they're doing just as well. That's this hypothetical. They're doing just as well as all the others with government certified teachers and a lot of tax money being redistributed by the government. That's very significant. So it's a hypothetical, but it's something to keep in mind regarding research.
I'm going to add one more thing to that. I also think we would see similar, like I think the charter school wrinkle would be there.
To count, you have to keep building and be focused. So achievement motivation is my focus, and I think I actually would just replicate this same study with another sample, because then I would be able to see what correlated, what was similar, what was different.
The short answer is I don't know. My research agenda actually is studying, measuring character and understanding how it's developed. Obviously, this probably has some relevance to homeschooling. But to directly answer your question, the next question I'm answering regarding homeschooling, I don't know. I'm happy to hear other questions you would like to have answered, and I could think about how to answer them. But
Researcher for hire.
Right.
I think I have a dream that there are certain academics who are, they would say they're just critical of the research. but I think that they're actually critical of home education. And I would like to, maybe, is this being recorded? Whoopsie. Okay, being recorded. Okay, being recorded. It'd be kind of interesting, it'd be kind of fun to have a couple of these researchers who think that there really is very little known about home education, for example, in terms of academic achievement. Say, hey, how about you design the perfect study, you get the funding for it, and I'll work on it with you collaboratively and see what we find out. I think it'd be kind of fun to do, just sort of a collaborative effort on that kind of thing.
I've got a comment to Mrs. Debra Bell for this first group, the most left one, not religious, but with the best academics.
That they're less than the rest of them. Okay, so they're not. You know, I mean, I just want to be clear that they were less conservative, less religious than the rest of the people in the group.
That's something with what astonished me a lot because I came here with a hypothesis that it should be like that. And your researches that show that.
So I validated your assumptions.
That's really great for me as a guy who did a master thesis on fundamental theology, on a philosophy of Karol Wojtyła, later John Paul II, and this what's happening there for me philosophically is strongly related to that what Sugata Mitra is doing with this what Maria Montessori was doing 100 years ago, which is not strongly connected to conservative point of view, but also not liberal point of view, but somewhere between with personalistic point of view, which is still not very well defined. But what shows why that thing's happening. Karol Wojtyła book, The Acting Person, is the great theory of why this is happening. That's why I'm very deeply interested in the details of your researches to put all this theory into precise categories and to compare it with numbers. So I'm very glad to hear all of this, and of course, would be very glad also to discuss about it in the meantime.
Well, you're invited to be the 11th person to read my dissertation if you'd like all the details.
With a pleasure.
I had a comment I wanted to make, Dr. Ray, when you talked about when there's no correlation. I'm reminded of a very powerful result that you had in one of your studies, which showed that there was no correlation to family income on how well homeschoolers performed. And that was a very powerful, at least no significant correlation to family income. Very powerful to say it was just as good for the, go ahead.
There was another one that happened in, it's probably been one of the most significant pieces of information that homeschool advocates have used in the United States. We divided up the 50 states into high government control, medium government control, and low government control, and found no significant difference between those three groups in terms of children's achievement. That's been extremely powerful by advocates to use that. Another example.
Right. I had a question also, Lauren, for you. Your population, you said, came from the Great Homeschool Convention mailing list. No, I've been to those conventions. I know the kind of people who typically come, which are usually new homeschoolers. At least what I've seen at those, you don't have people who've been homeschooling for 8 or 10, 12 years coming to that convention. So would that have influenced your results?
That was actually not borne out in the data. So the data actually show that more than 50% were in the 4 to 7 year category,
Okay,
and
good.
probably another 18 to 22 were in the 8+ year category. So again, that might be something. People who want to respond to a survey are longtime homeschoolers, and I'm actually working with them to see if they have any demographic information, so I can see if there are any group differences that I need to account for with the folks who actually responded.
Hi, again. I think maybe this is a question for people who are not from the United States. What do you refer to when you say academic achievement? How do you measure academic achievement? What is academic achievement?
So in the U.S., states are required to give tests in math and English every year. So yeah, these are standardized tests that are given every year to the students, and they have to be collected and reported.
So can I ask a following questions to that one? And how do you look to and for learning outside of academic
Achievement.
Sorry.
No, so actually that's a good point, and that's one of the problems of recent research in education in the U.S. Look, people like me like data, and the data that's available is academic outcome, test scores usually, and so of course we flock to them. And now I think we're turning the page. We're kind of changing now because. We're finding other outcomes that aren't captured by tests that matter for well-being in life, and we're starting to try to figure out measures to do that.
That's
so
why you're going to measure leadership.
that's why I'm doing character. I'm doing character research.
I think we have another question.
May I have a question?
Yes.
I'm quite often people ask me, are there any studies about unsuccessful cases of unschooling? So people unschooled and they failed, were no good results, and what are the reasons? What are those families, and something about this issue?
So I have some of that data that was not included in the analyses. I only looked at parents who were currently homeschooling, and I had about 400 responses that are no longer homeschooling. So that data is certainly available. I haven't dug into what they say yet.
So they say the reason why they're not homeschooling
Yeah,
now.
so they were homeschooling for a very short time, like 1 to 3 years, and they actually list the reason that they stopped
Okay,
homeschooling.
great.
Yeah.
This would be great.
I'll also add that, so typically when we say, when we look at group differences between, say, homeschoolers and non-homeschoolers, we have to keep in mind those are just averages between the two groups. And so so there's two groups, homeschoolers, non-homeschoolers. If you just look at homeschoolers by themselves, there's also a range of outcomes there. We can't forget that there's a range there. And so that average, it might be higher than the non-homeschooling group, but there are students in that group that are still lower and perform more poorly than the non-homeschoolers. So we got to keep in mind, and I mean, this is the whole, one of the things for homeschooling, right? That we can focus on the individual child. I think we also have to recognize that there may be some situations where for that particular child, the homeschooling context may not be the ideal. So we just got to keep in mind, right? If we want to serve students the best, I mean, let's find that solution, whether it's homeschooling or not.
Yes, please.
I'm not sure I will be very clear, but I had a feeling I wanted to share. This question is most for the three of you who were homeschooled or homeschooled your kids. I had the feeling that I was wondering how you could put together the fact to have a political or a kind of distance to the public school system and had a real active political behavior by homeschooling or being homeschooled, and now to participate the I would say, the mainstream university way of thinking, and because we expressed, and I share them, some distance toward statistics and evidence-based policy, but research. But you are trying to make this research too. So I was just wondering how you could. I don't know if it's a relevant question, but put together your own behavior towards public schools for you or for your children, and your relationships toward mainstream science. You know, because I had the feeling that you had different ways to behave in one way and the other. It was just a feeling. I don't know if it's worth.
So my family's laughing because. So I love education very broadly. I taught in public schools, I taught in charter schools, I've worked with several hundred teachers over the last couple of years. And I'm very interested in equitable and adequate education for all children, no matter what the structure that is. I want them to be in the best setting for their needs. And I'm also interested in public schools as truly public and democratic spaces. And I want to find out how parents and guardians are able to use and to acquire the services for themselves and their children through all of those venues.
I just recognize my limitations, Philippe. I know I'm an advocate, and it's too late in life for me to change that. But in order to try to participate as objectively as possible in the scientific project, I mean, I had advisors who helped me with my study. I did disclose in my dissertation, but I recognize my biases, so I would like to collaborate on research going forward and encourage people like yourself who are not compromised by your advocacy. But it's hard to do. Yeah, it is hard to do, to try to. So I myself cannot do it. I cannot be an academic researcher who is objective, and I recognize that. So I'm not going to try to do that.
Philippe, I've been becoming increasingly philosophical over the years anyway, and I recognize, and to me it's a perfect truism that no scholar is objective. Every scholar has biases, presuppositions, slants, angles, and the reality is, looking at the United States, for example, almost the vast majority of professors have a vested interest in the public school system. Whether they will recognize it or not, they have a very big vested interest. Their bread and butter is teaching teachers to teach in government schools who receive huge amounts of money through forced redistribution of wealth. And so it doesn't intimidate me. And so then, as a mostly quantitative researcher, it's up to reviewers and the critics to give my studies a pass or not. That's fine, and it's fine for me to be critiqued, and I just do my best.
I think we have time for your follow-up.
Oh, thanks. No, I just wanted to, because when I was hearing Debra, I hope there is no misunderstanding. I was absolutely not saying that you are objective or not. That was not my remark.
Yeah,
okay.
I think I got that.
Okay,
yeah.
thanks. Because and the second point. Okay, thank you. No, the idea is that could we? So another way to put it is, could we imagine to make a science that would be as different as a science as mainstream today science as homeschool was an alternative to mainstream school system? That was my question. You know, see?
You want like our help in reinventing science?
Because yes, just the way you did for public education. That's what I mean. I hear that you are really you accept the dominant way to make science by trying to do these statistics that are not dominant in our little countries.
I'm moving to France.
Yeah. So it's. I just wanted to say that it's strange to see you to play this game. You, the pioneers of alternative education. You know what? That's just a feeling I wanted to share.
Thank you. Thank you. On that note.
Yes. Well, I hope that all of these and more conversations continue. Thank you for spending your time with us. The next session is in 25 minutes back here, I believe. Yes. So we've got 3 more papers to hear. Go grab some coffee and some snacks, and we'll see you back here.